Hey, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about how in Louisiana, a spouse can reserve the income from their separate property as their separate property. So I'm Paul Rabley, I'm an estate planning attorney. This is a topic that a lot of people get confused about. We'll start with the basics. There's a presumption in Louisiana that, and I'll read it from the statute, things in the possession of a spouse during the existence of a marriage are presumed to be community. So if you're not sure what it is, it's community property owned by both spouses. Now, in our community property rules, generally things acquired during the marriage are community property, owned 50-50 by each spouse. There are some exceptions. The three typical exceptions to the community property rules: property that is the separate property of a spouse is things that a spouse brings into the marriage. If a spouse brings an account with $100,000 into the marriage on the moment that they get married, that $100,000 account is the separate property of the spouse who brought it into the marriage. And inheritance is the separate property of the spouse who inherited. If the wife inherits a house from her parents, that's her separate property. And then things donated to a spouse during the marriage are the separate property of that spouse. If mom and dad donate $30,000 to their son who's married, that $30,000 is the separate property of the spouse who received the donation. Other than that, generally things are community. If you have more rules, you have more questions about that, you can have someone help you look into that. Okay, but where people get confused is there's a rule here in Louisiana that says the natural and civil fruits of the separate property of a spouse are community property, and that's where everybody gets mixed up. Cajun Charlie says, yeah, when I got married, I had that $200,000 account and I just kept it separate. Yeah, it's grown, it's had some interest, it's had some dividends, all of which have gone back into the account. I also had a piece of rental property that I inherited, and all the rent from that property went into that account. That's my money, my spouse, that's my own personal property. Spouse doesn't have any of that. Well, Cajun Charlie's wrong, because all of that interest and all of those dividends and all of that rent that the separate property produced is community property. And really what gets messed up even more is when the community property and the separate property get mixed, so you can't tell what is what. Because of our presumption of community property, it all becomes community property. And then if they get divorced, Cajun Charlie's got to split it. So sometimes the Cajun Charlies of the world, they don't want those natural and civil fruits or that income or those dividends or those rents from their separate property to be community property. So here in Louisiana, we say, or at least our laws provide that a spouse may reserve that income as his or her separate property as provided in this article. So they have to sign a declaration, and it has to meet certain formalities, and a copy of the declaration shall be provided to the other spouse prior to the filing of the declaration, and the declaration has to be filed in certain conveyance records of certain parishes depending upon where they owned and where that spouse owned real estate or immovable property. So if Cajun Charlie has some separate property that's producing some interest and some rent and some dividends, and he wants all of that income to be his separate property, and they didn't do a prenup, then he's got to make a declaration and meet all of those formality requirements. So be aware of that. A lot of people not knowing that, they just assume that if they have some separate property and it produces some revenue or income, that the income is also separate property, but it's not. So make sure you get all that stuff addressed the right way ahead of time. It's really too late once all of that income has been commingled. The community income gets commingled with the separate property, and then it just becomes a real mess. So you've earned what you have. It's time to protect it. And so what I'd like to see you do is I want to make a bunch of these little nugget videos. Make sure you give it the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and then post a helpful comment so other people who see these videos, they can learn from your experiences and whatever knowledge you may be able to provide to these folks. All right, I'm Paul Rabelais, estate planning attorney. Have a great day.